of Councillor Fred Nix, who is also the Deputy Mayor of the town of Mono, and Councillor Gail Little, who is the Deputy Mayor of the Township of Amaranth. So we're going to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the County of Dufferin resides within the traditional territory and ancestral lands of the Tianantati, Attawandaron, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples. We also acknowledge that various municipalities within the County of Dufferin reside within the treaty lands named the Haltovan Deed of 1784 and two of the Williams Treaties of 1818, Treaty 18, the Nottawasaga Purchase, and Treaty 19, the Adjutant's Treaty. These traditional territories upon which we live and learn are steeped in rich Indigenous histories and traditions, and it is with this statement that we declare to honor and respect the past and present connection of Indigenous peoples with this land, its waterways, and resources. I'm going to turn it over to Yao.
Thank you, Councillor Mills. Okay, so thank you all for coming to our very first session. Welcome. I see there are a number of folks joining us online as well. If my count is correct, that's probably about 30 plus people, so you're all welcome as well. My name is Yao Enin. I am the Manager of Economic Development over here at the County of Dufferin, and joined here by a couple of colleagues of mine. I don't want to introduce all of them, but Raj San, our director, as well as our CAO, Sonia is here as well, and some colleagues, Jasmine, a couple of Jasmines. So yeah, you're all welcome. I'm just here to introduce our speaker. I don't want to waste any more time, but a couple of months ago, I would say, I was thinking and talking to my colleague Jasmine, the other Jasmine, about the tariffs and what it means for our county and the impacts that it could have. And at the time, I think a lot of people still believed that it was sort of political bluster, but I thought it would be real. And so I messaged the busiest guy that I know, whether he was available to come speak to our businesses in Dufferin about tariffs and how we sort of collectively work together to stifle some of the impact that it'll have. And so speaking of the busiest man I know, he is the director of the University of Waterloo's Economic Development Program, where he provides professional training to economic developers across Canada and internationally. He was recently appointed the vice chair of the Board of Directors for Invest Ontario and has served on the Board of Directors for the Economic Development Association of Canada, as well as the Economic Development Council of Ontario. He began his career in the United Nations, leading development projects in over 30 countries, before returning to Canada to lead economic development agencies in Nova Scotia and in Ontario. He later co-founded MDB Insights, which was Canada's largest specialist economic development consultancy, supporting over 300 communities with investment attraction and job creation. He's a widely published writer, sought after speaker, I would know. And he also holds a BA from the University of North Carolina, an MA in International Relations from Brock University, with an additional studies in Queens, Waterloo, and Université Sainte Anne. Whew, I got through that. That was long. Okay. Without much ado, can we introduce Brock Dickinson, please?
Thank you, Yao. I'm surprised that Yao invites me to these things. It's the second time that I've been to Dufferin County in the past year or so, and I was his professor in school. I was sure he'd had enough of me by the end of that. He was obviously one of our superstars, and it's great to see him do so well in a community like this. We have a few sort of technical things in the background, so we'll do our best to roll with it. Are the folks online able to hear everything okay? Perfect. So I've been traveling around the country, around the world, sort of talking a lot lately about this notion that it's the end of the world. In fact, the elected officials are here, have heard me sort of use that line before in a couple of instances, but I wanted to sort of build on that a little bit. We'll talk about part of why I think it's the end of the world, but I don't want to be doom and gloom today. So as we talk about Trump and tariffs, I also want to emphasize that it's not the end of the world, right? That there's things going on that we obviously have to be really concerned about, and And we need to really try to understand and wrap our heads around a bit, but that doesn't mean there aren't some interesting opportunities out there for our communities, for our organizations, for our businesses. And so I want to explore a fair bit of that today. But there is a sense, part of the reason I've been talking about how it's the end of the world is this sense that we're poised at some kind of moment in history almost, right? It feels like something big is happening. Things are really changing. There's some scary stuff going on out in the world, and it's hard to kind of wrap our heads around all of what it means. We think about pandemics and inflation and wars and all these things, and we've dealt with a lot in the last 5 years, right? And now we're going to throw Trump and tariffs and all this into the mix. So I get it that we feel some angst and some stresses. I'm at a university these days, so I get to read a lot of really boring books of people thinking about this stuff all the time so that nobody else has to. I've thrown up a few books here on the screen, just some of the ideas about big changes that are underway, big transformations in the way people are thinking about how the world works. And just to pluck out one of those, this guy here, this is a fellow named Ray Dalio. And Ray Dalio is the head of the largest hedge fund in the world, the largest investment fund. And his take on this is, yeah, the world's about to change, everything's falling apart. China is about to rise to dominance, and the West is in decline, right? That's an interesting kind of idea. What does he do to prove that? Well, he has a chart, and I think, okay, a chart, that's interesting. If you don't find that chart too convincing, well, he's got some more complicated charts that'll explain it in even more detail. And if you're still not convinced, well, then I'm afraid we kind of end up in this sort of space where we've got so much data and so many numbers. And so part of what I've been traveling around the country trying to do is to sort of say, okay, what is going on out there? How do we kind of figure out which of these numbers mean something, which of these are really telling us about what's going on, and what they can how they can inform us about the sorts of things that we should be doing at the local level. And of course, the whole Donald Trump situation just kind of flows right into this, right? We're already stressed. We've already got big issues that we're dealing with. And now we have this kind of new layer of uncertainty. Donald Trump's been president for 6 weeks. It feels like it's been about 60 years, right? There's just so much going on all the time. And I think part of it is, as we try to think about what his agenda is, as we talk about tariffs, we talk about trade wars, what is it that he's really trying to accomplish? Well, first, it was about NATO funding, right? Remember those days? Like we aren't pulling our weight in NATO, so we better watch out. We could be in trouble. Well, it turned out not to be NATO funding. It was actually fentanyl, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe it was fentanyl because that sort of disappeared for a while. It's back in the last couple of days, but fentanyl kind of fell off the radar. And no, this is really about the fact that he doesn't like Trudeau and he's going to get rid of Trudeau, right? So, sort of 2-3 weeks into his presidency, we've already had 3 reasons why we might have a trade war together. But it turned out not to be so much about getting rid of Trudeau and more about this notion that he believed we had a $200 billion trade subsidy that the US was giving to Canada every year, right? Like some wonky math in the middle of that, but okay, at least that's a reason. It was different than all the previous reasons. But since then we found out, well, no, it's not really about the trade subsidy. It's this notion that tariffs could be used to replace income tax in the United States. Well, that's a new idea. I didn't hear about that when we were talking about fentanyl and Trudeau and stuff like that. And then I would say that the most recent is this whole kind of discussion of the 51st state concept, right? And so part of the frustration or concern as we try to think about what Trump means, what he means when he says things, what he means for us on the receiving end of it, is that we don't know. It keeps changing, right? There isn't a lot of clarity or consistency to the messages coming from south of the border. So it makes it really difficult for us to respond to this kind of rhetoric, to sort of say things. And I'll say, don't ask me where this is going next, because I've been struggling last night, today, to sort of say, I got to do a session on Trump at 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. Like, what's he going to do at 1:45? And I'll tell you, apparently, he had a phone call with Justin Trudeau at 1 o'clock, so an hour and a quarter ago. And in that call, he apparently asked Trudeau when the next election is going to be. And when Trudeau said, I don't know, Trump took that as, oh, now you're playing a game because you want to try to stay in power. Right? So we just never know what's going to come next in all of this, right? It's sort of, it's chaotic in some frightening ways. And in fact, Paul Krugman, he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, recently wrote an article in which he said that the chaos monkeys have taken over the zoo. This was his description of the Trump administration coming into power. The chaos monkeys, and he had a great illustration for that article that he wrote. And there is this sense that sometimes you think maybe he's crazy like a fox, and there's this sort of canny strategy to stuff that's going on. Other times you think like, this is just nuts, this makes no sense. But whether we give him credit for being a savvy negotiator and politician, or whether we just think it's random and aimless, it's all chaos all the time. And it's this sort of sense of chaos that contributes to our sense of powerlessness. Like, how do we respond when we don't know what comes next? How do we know what to do when we just get this stream of crazy ideas? So, we get the notion, imagine the president of the United States says, oh, Canada, you would make a great 51st state, right? Like, how are we supposed to respond to that, right? I think certainly it gets our nationalistic ire up. We start to really resent those kinds of comments, but practically, what do we do? We respond on Twitter or X, right? Or should we be doing something more substantial? And part of it is, by the time we sort of figure out how to respond to the 51st state, well, he's on to the next great idea, like the Gulf of America, right? And so everybody sort of shifts focus and attention and starts to talk about something different for a few days. I always say, nobody tell them about the Canadian Shield, okay? Because we could be next in line for something like this. And once things have sort of blown over a little on Gulf of America, then we start to talk about invading Greenland, right? Like of all the ideas, where does this come from? What does this tell us about where we're going? And after the invasion of Greenland, well, I don't worry too much about the invasion of Greenland. I always say I've seen that movie before. And the Empire loses in the end. So I'm not too worried about the invasion of Greenland. I don't take that one too seriously. But then he does come out with stuff that sort of seems just as crazy, but wades into really tense geopolitical situations. So the US is going to take over the Gaza Strip, right? Like, that one came out of left field, right? Like, and that one stirs a lot of strong feelings in a lot of places and a lot of concerns about what this could lead to. And not only did we say, oh, yeah, we can take over the Gaza Strip, let's double down and release a video about what it's going to look like, complete with a giant golden statue of myself, right? And so how do we respond? What do we do in reaction to these things? And when we start to kind of put this in the context very specifically of tariffs and a trade conflict, how much of this is crazy AI videos and how much of this is serious foreign policy that the new government is trying to pursue? How do we read out the different elements of this? And so I think this is one of the big challenges that we've got, is what is actually going on here? What does this stuff start to mean? And if we are headed into a trade war, what are the implications of that, both in terms of what's going to happen to our communities and our businesses and the kinds of things that we need to get ready for in response to some of that? I'm unfortunately not going to have all the answers to those questions today. This is the first of a 5-week series, a 5-session series on this topic. I've got some things that I think can be helpful as we sort of move forward, but we'll have to kind of continue to do this over the next few weeks and months as this rolls out, because what's happening today is different than what we're going to see in a week's time because of the way in which this stuff keeps jumping around. And that kind of lack of clarity creates uncertainty in a whole series of spaces. So like Yao and his colleagues, I work in the economic development realm. That is, how do we bring investments and jobs and economic activity to local communities? There was a survey done recently of folks working in this field to sort of say, well, when you think about investment flowing into communities, what will the impact of Trump's approaches be?
That would be easy enough next week. I'm not doing catering for it. I'm just doing coffee and tea from Jason.
Sorry, Jasmine, I've lost the control here as well. we don't have a lot of clarity, and so it's difficult for us to kind of make formal plans and sort of have the 10-step instructions on what you can do if you're sort of wrestling with these issues. I do think that one of the things that we have been doing fairly effectively at that larger level is that our political leaders have been good at trying to engage American political leaders, right? First thing off, we've got the Prime Minister and a couple of cabinet members go off to Mar-a-Lago to try to get things working out. And a number of the premiers, a number of cabinet members have been working very hard since the beginning of the year to try to kind of build those personal relationships. And we have to do that. But it's hard to know where that goes. I think you look at the folks at the table, there's a lot of kind of forced smiles going on there, right? Like this is not the most relaxed session. I would say if I was at that table, I don't think I'd look even that happy. The person there that I kind of feel like is just right in the back. So we can actually blow that up a bit there, right? This is like half panic and half, oh, this is a bunch of nonsense, right? And that's about my state of mind most of the time when I'm thinking about all these issues. It's hard to know how else to react on these things. Part of what's happening here is that the whole tariff discussion is feeding into or fitting into a very long series of issues in North American politics. So on the Canadian side of the border, as we hear tariffs and trade and that sort of thing, it fits into a discussion that's been going on at least 125 years. So the current free trade structure that we have in place really dates to the 1987 federal elections here in Canada. The free trade agreement between Canada and the US was signed as a result of that election, which was fought between the Liberal leader, John Turner, and the Conservative Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. The Liberals were opposed to entering into a free trade deal, saying this is just going to lead to tensions and chaos and we'll be vulnerable to the Americans in the future. They may have been right. The Conservatives were saying, we want a free trade deal because this is going to create lots of amazing business opportunities for Canadian companies. They may have been right as well, right? And there's this sense that entrenched in the Canadian discussion are these two opposing perspectives, both of which are grounded in a bit of a reality, and yet both of which sort of suggest divergent courses of action. This was not the first election, though, that we fought on this issue. If we go back to the 1911 federal election, it was fought between the Conservative leader, the guy with the mustache there, Robert Borden, and the Liberal leader, Wilfrid Laurier. Now, interestingly, the roles of the political parties were reversed in that election. So the Conservatives were against free trade with the United States, and the Liberals were in favor of it. It turned out to be a very tough fought election. The Conservatives won this, and the slogan that they used to win was, no trucker trade with Yankees. We don't want to trade with those Americans. They'll just double cross us. We need to be strong and independent and separate. And that was the slogan that carried the election. The interesting thing, when we look at those 1911 election results, we can see the Liberal Party in red, the Conservative Party in blue. There's Alberta in its traditional Liberal glory, right? So it looks at first blush like things have changed a lot since then. But the reality is some of the positions that emerged in that election are kind of the same. So Ontario voted very strongly to fight against this free trade notion, to sort of, don't let the Americans bully us. Let's make sure that we throw our weight around. We show them what's really going on, and we make sure that we have a strong response to anything that the Americans do. The Albertans were saying, maybe this isn't all it's made up to be. Maybe we should be a little bit closer. We should be a little nicer. We should be a little bit friendlier. And interestingly, although, politicians change parties and names, the parties aren't the same as they were 100 years ago. Those kind of election results sort of mirror the divergent approaches we see between Danielle Smith and Doug Ford today, right? With Ford sort of leading the charge on, don't let those Americans get us. We got to stand up to them. And Danielle Smith being much more conciliatory, and we won't necessarily cut off our energy. We'll wait to see what happens, that kind of thing. So part of what's going on in the context of the tariff discussion is that we've got this kind of long cultural history of thinking about these issues and what they mean in the Canadian context. And so when somebody says 51st state, it stirs a lot of that up in us. What we have to kind of recognize is that the Americans are also coming to this with a series of sort of biases and preconceived notions, but they're very different than the ones that we have. So for example, the typical American does not have a good sense of how the North American economy functions. Most Canadians know we're very reliant on the US market, that we're closely tied economically to what's going on there. But most Americans don't understand the linkages that they have with Canada. And so this chart here just shows one quick example of that is Americans perceive that most of the oil that they buy from outside of the US comes from Saudi Arabia. And in fact, of course, it comes from Canada. Right? They don't understand that kind of a trade linkage. And so when somebody says trade war, we're going to tariff the Canadians, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but we buy from Canada anyway, right? So part of it is that they just don't get as wound up about these issues as we do. The flip side is that there's another stream of thought in American history, which revolves around the idea of manifest destiny, that God has foreordained the United States to control the North American continent, right? That this is America's destiny, it's America's right. And when you think about something that stretches from the Panama Canal to Greenland, that's manifest destiny in its most blatant expression, right? That this is all naturally and spiritually American territory, and we're just kind of finally taking control of what should be ours. And this American perception plays out in a whole series of different ways. In 1775, General Montgomery leads an army north to capture Montreal during the American Revolution. He says, "I will lay my life on it, that with 1,500 men and the proper artillery, I will take Montreal." It's natural that the Americans should just be able to walk in and take control of Quebec. In 1812, Thomas Jefferson says, "The acquisition of Canada this year will be a mere matter of marching." All I have to do is march. I'm not going to fight. If I march north in 1812, Canada will cease to exist. In the 1840s, President James Polk runs on the slogan, 54-40 or fight. I'm trying to figure out where the border is going to be between Canada and the US. He says it's going to be at 54 degrees, 40 minutes north. The border today is actually at the 49th parallel. But the notion was, well, we're naturally entitled to that extra 5.5 degrees, right? Like that should logically be part of the states, right? And so when Trump talks about the 51st state, it's not that this is an aberration or that this is some strange new idea that nobody's talked about. It's a return to some of these traditional ideas in American politics. Now, we might not have heard them much in the last 75 years, but it's not something that is completely unknown. And so it does have a constituency in the US. This does resonate with some people. If America is the greatest nation in the world, why shouldn't it control Canada and Panama and Greenland and the Gulf of America and everything else, right? And so we end up in this sort of trade context with two kind of worldviews that are colliding around the issue of how well we're going to work together in terms of exchanging goods and services across that border. Now, tariffs are something that have been around quite a bit in American history. So this chart here, particularly that orange line, shows that the level of tariffs, how they've been over the course of the last 200 years or so. And you can see that since the end of the Second World War, there really hasn't been much in the way of tariffs. But before that, tariffs were kind of a common feature of American policy. Way back, starting in the 1820s, that's just, we can go back all the way to the 1820s, that first kind of wave of American tariffs were known as the tariff of abominations. I would say they knew how to name tariffs back then, for sure, right? Like what a great name, the tariff of abominations. And it's interesting to kind of go back and study those tariffs. They were 38% tariffs on all manufactured goods and 45% tariffs on any raw materials, natural resources, and things like that. So even higher than what we're talking about today. The interesting thing about this process is that at the time, nobody wanted the tariffs. Both parties in the US Congress were opposed to tariffs, but because they were so busy fighting each other, they kind of accidentally backed into approving the tariffs, and they're trying to stare each other down in a bit of a standoff, and they ended up with the tariffs in place. And it almost prompted a civil war in the US in 1832. So tariffs are one of these issues that really divide the states. One of the accusations at the time was, well, why does the US want tariffs? Because the president is trying to be a dictator. The president is trying to be a despot, really wants to take more control than they're entitled to. I would say that's kind of, some of what we're hearing these days as well in this context. Interesting, the Republicans were the party that passed the tariffs. Republicans, also known as the GOP, we see one of the editorial cartoons from a couple hundred years ago at the time. And part of what was happening there was a regular or traditional faction of Republicans, and then there was an incoming group called the insurgents, very similar in many ways to MAGA, or and so it was this struggle for control of the party, and it created this kind of erratic back and forth approach within the Republican Party that was part of how we accidentally ended up with tariffs in the 1820s, right? So I think there's a lot of interesting parallels, and my fear is that even though the vast majority of Canadians don't want tariffs, and even though most Americans probably don't want tariffs, we could end up in one of these accidental situations where the abomination of tariffs comes in, even though nobody really wants it, right? Like who's standing up to who and who's playing what political games, and next thing you know, we're all struggling with tariffs, even though we didn't really want to get there. I would say a lot of this is happening in a kind of a deeper geopolitical context as well. There's some other big issues that are kind of reshaping the way that the economy is functioning right now. And the tariff question sort of plays into some of this. So one of those things that's changing is that the demographic structure of much of the world is changing as well. So throughout most of human history, we've had a growing global population. In fact, we're starting to sort of realize that we may be at the front end of a significant decrease in global population. There's certainly areas that are still growing, parts of West Africa, parts of South Asia, but in many parts of the world, the population is aging, and the number of young people is too few to replace that aging population as it eventually passes away. So how do we measure this kind of stuff? Well, traditionally we use a thing called a population pyramid. So this is the population pyramid for Niger in West Africa, a country in West Africa. The blue side of that pyramid is men. The red side is women. The stuff you see at the bottom, the broad base of that pyramid, is 1-year-olds. And at the very top are 100-year-olds. Well, lots of 1-year-olds in a population, not very many 100-year-olds in most populations. So traditionally, this is what all population pyramids look like. We had lots of babies, the average family had 4, 6, 8 kids, lots of kids running around. The unfortunate reality was not all of those kids survived their first birthday. So you had slightly fewer 2-year-olds than 1-year-olds, slightly fewer 3-year-olds than 2-year-olds. And by the time you get to 100, there's not many folks left, right? So this creates that kind of pyramid effect. And that's what most populations have looked like throughout human history. Here's what the Italian population pyramid looks like today. Here's the German population pyramid. And here's the Chinese, here's the European Union as a whole. If we take out France, France has a different structure, but everybody else in Europe, we can see this kind of hollowing out at the bottom. What this means is we have lots and lots of older people, that's that bulge that we see further up, but very, very few younger people. There are very, very few young people in many places around the world. And one of the most extreme examples of this is in China. So in China, there's some interesting things happening. We can kind of get a little more detail. The blue line across the top is the Chinese birth rate. Okay? So why are there so few young people in China? A couple of reasons. One-child policy. Right? So for 2 parents to have only 1 child just means you're naturally going to see a decrease in the population. But the other thing is, look at that middle section there under the brackets of that blue line. There's a sort of an area that's relatively flat. Demographers always say, if you see something that's flat like that, it means it's a lie. What's happening in China? Well, funding for municipalities in China is not based on property taxes. It's based on the number of 5-year-olds who are entering kindergarten. So if you want to raise your municipal budget, just overestimate the number of 5-year-olds you have, right? And if every community in the country does this for 5, 10, 15 years, you end up with a massive overestimate of what your population actually is. And the current thinking is that the Chinese have been overestimating their population by about 100 million people. So we get this kind of fake number. When we take it out, it reduces the Chinese population. We get the declining birth rate. And then the bottom line there, you see that orange line, that's the death rate. You can see it's been relatively flat in recent years. And that's because as China develops, their medical practices get better. And so people live longer. So while it was unusual a century ago for Chinese people to live, say, much past the age of 60, now it's very common to reach 90 or 100. And so you get this situation where there's no kids being born, and we've overestimated how many there are, but we have more and more old people in the community. And eventually, those old people will start to pass away. It just takes longer and longer. But what the implications are here is that the Chinese population will start to fall really significantly in the near future. So the best estimates a couple of years ago were that if we looked at the Chinese population of around 1.3, 1.4 billion, by the end of this century, around 2100, that would fall to about 800 million. More recently, we've updated those estimates, and some of the projections now suggest the Chinese population could fall from 1.4 billion to 488 million by the end of the century. So 2/3 of the population could disappear. That has some really interesting implications for the economy, right? China has become the world's manufacturing center over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Why? Well, they had a huge workforce, and that workforce was pretty inexpensive. So cheap labor drove a lot of companies to move their operations from places like Canada or the US or Europe and push them into places like China. But if the population is falling, then so is the size of the workforce. And in fact, the size of the workforce is shrinking faster than the population because China's got this aging population, but no young workers coming into the workforce. And so as that happens, workers become really scarce, and it drives up the cost of labor. It means that hiring a worker costs a lot more. And so suddenly China has no more cheap labor. But what's the rationale for China to be center of global manufacturing? Cheap labor. So suddenly there's no reason to have that manufacturing based in China anymore. It's not cost effective. You're a long way from your markets. The labor is expensive. And so part of what's happening out there is that we're getting this rethinking of where our investment should be and the opportunity to think maybe about bringing some of that back to North America. I'll come back to that idea in a minute, but the other side of the coin here is something that's often called deglobalization. So we've spent a number of years now talking about how we need to go global, the economy's globalizing, these sorts of things. In fact, if we look at trade patterns, global trade volumes have been falling since about 2008. The actual quantity of trade that we do internationally is declining. And there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the big ones is that after the Second World War, the US set up an international system of rules. It's sometimes called the global order. This is the United Nations, it's the World Bank, it's the International Monetary Fund. It was basically a kind of an agreement that, well, if you want to play in this global structure, you've got to follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, well, the US is there as a kind of global policeman to kind of try to make you follow the rules. The US doesn't want to be the global policeman anymore. It just has no interest in playing that role. It doesn't really want to be a NATO. It doesn't really want to get involved in international issues. It doesn't really want to be trading with anybody else if it can avoid it. And so it's kind of looking more inward and saying, we don't need to pay attention to all those old rules-based systems. And I would say this has led to kind of the reemergence of a whole bunch of things that we got used to not having in the 20th century. Things like war, piracy, sabotage, and even bad driving. So war, Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Hamas, civil war in Sudan. You get the sense that somehow Venezuela is threatening to invade Guyana, right? Like who had that on their bingo card? There's just this sense that somehow things are sort of bubbling over and nobody's really in a position to try to stop it. Piracy? Now, that used to be something we thought about in the context of the 17th century, but now the South China Sea, the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, piracy is becoming more and more common. And sabotage. We're blowing up each other's pipelines. We're bombing each other's oil tankers. We're cutting off the internet cables that link Europe to Asia, these sorts of things. There's something going on out there that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, but is now becoming more commonplace. And bad driving? Well, remember a couple of years ago when the Suez Canal got blocked because the ship made a wrong turn? And suddenly we realized how vulnerable we all were to something as simple like, the captain making the wrong decision and 2 weeks of trade got backed up and we couldn't buy toilet paper for a while. All of these sorts of things. And I would say that maybe that's a kind of a less extreme example. We know that could never happen in Canada, right? This is Montreal last year. And so we get this sense that part of what's happening is
this spreading of kind of chaos, that where once we had a rules-based system, we've lost the safety of the rules. And that has really big implications for a lot of our businesses at the local level. So the average gas-powered car, including the ones built here in Southern Ontario, contains 30,000 components. We set up this global distribution system to allow those parts to flow smoothly. And now we're suddenly discovering that maybe things don't flow as smoothly as we would like. So we see increased instability, which makes trade more difficult. This means that our supply chains are increasingly stretched and challenged. It's harder to get access to the things we need for our businesses or our communities. Energy costs rise as those supply chains get stretched. And that sort of tension in the energy space makes energy costs themselves go up. Businesses start to feel more vulnerable, but there are more risks that they're facing. So insurance costs begin to rise. And we sort of get the sense that even the cost of construction starts to rise in the face of all of this. What do I mean by that? Well, think about the typical road construction project in Ontario. As we build roads, we typically start with rebar. Where does the rebar come from? Well, in Ontario, it traditionally came from the Mariupol steel plant in Ukraine. The Russians destroyed that plant 2 years ago. So now, if you want to build a road, where do you get that steel? Well, yes, there are other sources, but I've got to find them. I got to negotiate with them. I got to hope that I can get a price somewhere close to what I was paying the Ukrainians. I have to then get that stuff here through pirates and wars and everything else. And so not only does that make road construction more expensive, it also makes it slower. This sort of twin set of challenges. And so part of what all of this does is it says, maybe we are moving away from a global economy. If we can't handle those supply chains, and we've got all these political challenges, all this sort of chaos out there, we want to do stuff closer to home. So I can't be global anymore. I need to be more regional in my focus. So maybe I'm going to try to keep my business within North America rather than sort of saying, I'm going to do this with China, I'm going to do this with Europe or something like that. That North America, like other regions, becomes kind of a unit to itself. It's sort of separated off. And in the context of manufacturers, for example, leaving places like China, it means that these regional hubs become sort of destinations for reinvestment, for reshoring economic activity. So manufacturers are leaving China, it's getting too expensive, they're coming back to North America. And we can see this is US data, this is the value of building permits for manufacturing facilities in the United States over the last couple of years. So what we're seeing right now, these are jobs and facilities that aren't yet built. They'll be built in the next year or two. The jobs will follow a year or two after that. But this is planned manufacturing construction. It's at the highest levels ever in recorded history. There is more money flowing into manufacturing, new manufacturing capacity in North America than we have ever seen before. So what do I think is going on? Well, part of it is a story that sort of suggests this kind of massive level of economic opportunity for the Canadian marketplace. I've always said I think these are 15 sectors that are poised for huge growth in the Canadian context. But in the sense of what's going on with Trump and trade, the questions are a little more complex. So part of this is why I've been kind of going out around the world sort of talking about these ideas. I launched a YouTube channel a few weeks back. I'm very proud. I have 262 followers now. I'm big time, right? But I think that we need to start talking about some of these other ideas. And part of what I think is happening here is that in the face of those massive inflows of investment coming back to North America, Trump's decided he wants to eat our lunch. Why should he let some portion of that go to Canada if he could get all of it back into the US? And so the tariffs in my mind are more about sort of preventing that investment from flowing north of the border and trying to kind of keep as much of it as possible south of the border. And so you start to make noise about the 51st state. Now, I'm a proud Canadian. I'll be quick to point out that the last time somebody tried to make us the 51st state, we had a war, right? We captured Detroit, we burned Washington to the ground, we staged an amphibious invasion of Louisiana. I like to talk tough, right? I could be premier of the province. I'm less keen to admit that they burned Toronto to the ground as well. So maybe this wasn't all so one-sided. But I think that part of what happens is we need to sort of regard this as one of those kind of existential challenges. With the whole 51st state stuff and the attempt to kind of take away some of our economic future, it is really dangerous. And we need to find really tangible, practical ways to respond. That means probably trade war. And trade wars don't benefit anybody. We will lose in a trade war. We might not lose the trade war itself, but we will definitely lose jobs, lose investment. It's going to be very painful for a lot of people. We were talking about the implications for the food bank a little bit earlier on, both in terms of the number of people who might need to access the services of the food bank and the cost of the food itself. Nobody really wins in a trade war. Your hope is always that the other side blinks first. But as we sort of think about what that trade war might mean, I think we have to be very practical about the implications. So here's some work from the Conference Board of Canada suggesting that the level of impact will vary from province to province. So Ontario is kind of fourth from the top on that list, but percentage-wise, we're not that different from the province at the top, which is Alberta. That this could reduce the size of our economy right off the bat by about 1.3%, 1.4%. That is pretty substantial. That's pretty significant. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce has done some work trying to kind of think about which municipalities would be most impacted by a trade conflict. Dufferin is not on the list. It wasn't one of the communities they included, but we do see that Barrie and Guelph, which might be sort of relatively close comparators, are both on the end of the spectrum that are harder hit than other communities. And that may be some suggestion that Orangeville, Dufferin County, the communities in this area are also going to be among those that are a little bit harder hit. Why? Because the industries that we have here are ones that may be more vulnerable to those 30,000 part supply chains and component challenges, and that we rely so much on the easy movement of goods across the border that it can be very challenging for our local companies to thrive and survive without having access to that. So in the light of that, I sort of say, okay, I recognize all this stuff is going on, but what can I do about it? Like, what's the plan? Like, what's the practical thing that we can actually start to do in this context? And I think there's a couple of elements to that. So after the 9/11 attacks, the US government shut down the border. And it basically said, we're not opening up until we've got something to put in place to kind of improve the situation. Well, Canada for years had been trying to promote a border modernization plan. They had this strategy laid out for how to improve the borders, and the US had always been very resistant to that. But come 9/11, suddenly the US is saying, we need a plan, who's got a plan? And Canada could say, here's the plan. And it only took a matter of weeks to implement that border modernization strategy. So I guess one of the questions that I have is, where's our plan? Like, what's our plan? It's one thing to say tariffs are terrible, tariffs are going to hurt us, we don't want a trade war. What's the plan we've got to try to kind of make some of this happen? And I think that, to some extent, the federal government, in cooperation with the provinces, has been trying to lead a bit of a discussion on this. So the plan as it stands is probably a few key points. Prepare a list of retaliatory measures, right? Talk tough, get ready to kind of engage with the Americans and tit for tat kind of stuff. We don't know if that'll work or not, but it's the next, it's the first step in the plan that we do tend to have. What's the second step? Reduce interprovincial trade barriers. Okay, that's great. How many of you have been working on that today? Oh, perfect. So I think this is interesting because we've talked about this for 75 years, right? Like this is a no-brainer. We should have been doing this when I was like 2. But we haven't done it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be on it now. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have a plan, but the plan has to be more than saying, hey, we should reduce those interprovincial trade barriers. Well, how and what and where? So I'd really like to see the discussion move more strongly in that direction. We need to reduce our reliance on the United States and promote opportunities to buy Canadian. I agree. this starts to sound a little bit like some motherhood and apple pie kind of stuff, right? Like how is this going to help my local employers? I mean, yes, if I buy your products, that's good, but if you're losing everything out the other end in the States, then that's a challenge as well. So how do I kind of move beyond some of these, great sayings, things that make me feel good by saying them, into stuff that's much more tangible? I think the other element that we've talked about a lot in terms of our current plan is expand our export markets. Well, if we're not going to be reliant on the States, we're going to trade more with somebody else. But what have we done to open that up as well, right? So I think our plan at this point has to kind of move beyond these notions or towards these notions very quickly. Like, this is stuff that we absolutely have to do, but we can't kind of sit around and expect that somebody else is necessarily going to do it for us. And I would say the stuff on that list, it's like the Buckley's commercial, right? Like we all know we're supposed to do it. None of us really want to do it, but I guess if we did, it might help us a little bit. Tastes awful, but it works. But I think there's other things that we can start to do a little at the local level. So some of those things, I think, stem from the pandemic period that we've just come through, right? So what happened during the pandemic? We lost our ability to travel. We lost our ability to trade. We lost our ability to kind of get access to things. And as our restaurants, local stores began to kind of struggle, we said, hey, we should have some buy local campaigns, right? How are we going to support those local businesses? Well, pandemic ended a couple of years ago. We said, oh, we did a great job with that, right? Time to dust those buy local campaigns off and sort of bring them back out, right? We've already got that plan at least partly in place. What are we doing to sort of jump back into that context and say, hey, if we have a buy local campaign, isn't it more important now than ever? We should be thinking about things like staycations again, right? What happened during the pandemic? We couldn't travel. We recognized that many of our tourism operators, our hospitality businesses were really going to suffer. So we developed this whole kind of staycation sort of a market, vacation close to home. We need to be thinking about that again. 21 million Canadians a year travel to the US. Their travel is worth $21 billion. If we could bring even 10% of that back to the Canadian marketplace, that suggests some really interesting opportunities in the tourism space. That 10% of that $21 billion market is responsible for about 140,000 jobs in the US. This could be a stopgap measure for us as we try to kind of make some of our way through the current crisis. The other thing that we talked a lot about during the pandemic was kind of mapping the supply chains for our companies. So where are our goods coming from, and where are they going to, and where are the vulnerabilities in that process? Can we find the specific places where we're at risk of tariffs, or where our partners are at risk of tariffs? And if we know where the vulnerabilities are, then we can start to develop strategies to think about how to overcome them and how to plan around them. So Ontario Chamber of Commerce, here you go. There are a growing number of information sources out there as well, of other things that local businesses could be doing. 3 weeks ago, it felt like there wasn't much information. We're almost moving in the other direction now. We're all going to be overloaded, but there is some great material out there about how individual companies can start to kind of understand the risks associated with tariffs and the kinds of tools that might be available to start to address those risks. But I also think we need to sort of experiment with new kinds of tactics and new kinds of tools. So what's being done in other places and in other jurisdictions that we could copy here in Canada to help overcome some of these things? So in Finland, for example, they have this great program called Vientirengas. It's export circles. And basically, they get companies that are in similar areas to group together to target new export markets. Now, those companies tend to be in kind of similar kinds of businesses. So imagine a ski manufacturer that's interested in kind of moving into Belgium as a new marketplace. So that ski manufacturer might get together with some other sporting goods manufacturers to team up and basically hire a sales rep in that new market. This is a program that is supported by the Finnish government, but it basically sort of takes the risk of going into a new market and shares it amongst several companies. So if hiring that new sort of export manager, export developer, and giving them some marketing materials is going to cost something like $150,000, that's a lot for one small or mid-sized company to bite off. But if I divide that 5 different ways, and I got a government grant that sort of matches what I'm doing, suddenly I'm looking at $10,000 to $15,000 to try this new export market. I'm not sort of saying that that's absolutely what we should do in the Canadian context, but there are ideas like this all around the world as companies have been working on these issues for many, many years. We don't need to invent or reinvent the wheel. We can take some of these notions and some of these ideas that have already been tried in other places and bring them to use in the Canadian context. And I think increasingly, one of the roles of economic developers, I'll throw down a bit of a challenge to Yao and his team here, is for those operating businesses, there's already a huge amount of information to try and stay on top of. So when it comes to kind of understanding what resources are out there, what information sources are there, what tools are there to help you, we're starting to see economic development departments across the country create portions of their websites that warehouse access to some of these tools and information. So that for a business in Dufferin, there's a kind of a one-stop place that you can go to learn about the range of programs and tools and studies and research that's out there, so you can start to find the things that could be useful to your business. And in a sense, the economic development teams are almost curating the best information that's available to make it readily accessible to businesses within the local community. And I think that that's one of the ways in which local government can play a role for local business that would be hard for the province or the feds to do, because they can really think about what kind of businesses exist in our community, what kinds of information is going to be most useful to them. I also think we see some interesting things happening out there. So there's a company in Quebec called Transcontinental Inc. It's the largest printer of comic books in North America, right? And what are we going to learn from comic books in the context of a trade war? Comic books are manufactured in Canada and then exported to the States. And so they're immediately subject to that 25% tariff. Well, comic books, they're a low dollar item. So an extra 25% makes a big difference in that particular marketplace. Transcontinental Inc. has basically said that for the next 3 months, it will eat the tariff itself. Right? And this is basically a way of ensuring that comic book distributors, comic book companies, comic book shops don't go out of business because they've suddenly been overwhelmed by the cost. Now, I recognize not every company has deep enough pockets to do what Transcontinental is doing. But talk about buying goodwill in your industry. They're not saying we're going to do this forever. They're saying there's a crisis and the chaos monkeys might change their mind within 3 months. So we're just going to kind of hold the fort until then. We're going to make sure that those downstream businesses are not threatened, are not disappearing because of the chaos monkeys, that we kind of buy a period of time and hope that we can sort of figure out a better solution over that period of time. So I'm not going to say that companies should do what Transcontinental is doing, but it's an example of the kind of creative thinking within the marketplace. Transcontinental is not saying, we're a Canadian company, let's punish our American customers. They're kind of saying, all right, let's forget the politics and figure out how we're going to save this sector so that 3 months from now or 6 months from now, as we sort of get this stuff resolved and the dust settles a bit, that we've still got an industry and an opportunity to kind of look at. And I think that sort of approach, that creative way of considering it is an interesting sort of an idea. So I would say that overall plans that companies have in place are starting to get better in this context. That we've gone from just kind of, panic to starting to think about the specific things that we can do. There is a really great piece of work that Deloitte just released, 8 pages in length. I've got the URL here. I think you'll have access to this presentation after the fact, but if you just Google Deloitte tariffs, it'll be probably the top thing that pops up. This is produced by Deloitte in Canada. It looks at the relative risks by industry, like which industries are going to be sort of most impacted by the tariffs. But I think the more important thing is that it provides a bit of a workbook to sort of do some planning within the context of a single company to sort of say, hey, here's how we get ready for the tariffs. And it does that by breaking things into 3 areas. On the sell side, as you think about the customers you're selling to, where are the risks that tariffs engage with in that space. On the buy side, as you think about the components and the inputs and the raw materials that you're working with, how do you kind of mitigate the tariff risks there? And then on the inside, so buy side, sell side, inside, how do you change the management approach of your company? And these are basically questionnaires that they've developed that allow you to kind of assess where your company is well positioned and where your company faces some pretty significant risks. And I think this is the kind of tool, as we move forward, we're getting a little more sophisticated each time with the kinds of resources that we can make available to businesses. This is the kind of thing that I think would fit well in the, that Welland website we showed from their economic development department, for example, of all the tools that they were keeping an eye on. This is the kind of thing that's starting to be released that we just don't know about, right? Like, this isn't on most people's radar. We don't have the time to go searching for this, but if we can kind of share the insights and share the information about what's out there, then I think it puts us in a good spot. And so ultimately, as I think about, what's my message in all of this? What I say is the key takeaway? Well, keep calm and get to work, right? Like maybe the sky's falling. Maybe the chaos monkeys are going to tear down civilization. And this is, it was nice knowing you, but I sort of feel like, no, at some point, calmer heads are going to prevail. Maybe it's when the New York Stock Exchange really tanks, or maybe it's when the big American industry starts to say, hey, this makes no sense. But at some point, cooler heads will prevail. And the more that we can do to kind of buy time until then, and to put in place some basic supports and tools to start to really understand how our companies can kind of weather the storm, then that's the approach that we need to sort of move forward. So sometimes it will feel like the end of the world. Sometimes it will feel really precarious, really risky. But I do think that there are opportunities to do some pretty significant things in this moment as well. And that if we do that, we might be able to separate some of the noise from some of what we really need to be focused on and make some real progress in this space. So I appreciate the chance to share those ideas with you, but we now have time to kind of talk about specific questions, specific issues, challenges that your organizations or your companies are facing, and to have a little bit of exchange within the group around what we can be doing to sort of get ready for this.
Brock, thank you so much for the presentation. I enjoy listening to you. I think you have tons of good knowledge, and you make it fun along the way, so I appreciate that. In Dufferin County specifically, Bill's here from our ag community. We have some other farmers in the crowd as well. I see Yao wanting to give me that. It doesn't work. Oh, it does.
My question specifically is in regards to the ag industry and specifically tariffs related to our ag industry. We do have a lot of our industry that does export, but also just wondering, there's been a lot of talk about manufacturers and how this is going to impact the manufacturing industry. But I would be curious to hear your thoughts on agriculture and tariffs and what you think about that.
Yeah, and then you mentioned, I think it was Bill. So maybe we'll get Bill to comment on this too. So I won't pretend to be a farmer or an ag expert. I think there's a couple of aspects to this, and one is short-term and long-term, and then the kind of the nature of the agricultural products that we might be dealing with in a specific case. I'm really worried about some of the horticultural sector, like the greenhouse use of cut flowers or even vegetables and tomatoes and things like that. That industry is almost exclusively focused on export to the States, and so that's going to be really tough. When we think about a lot of other agricultural products, we've perhaps become reliant on the U.S. market, but there could be alternative markets for us to sell to, whether that's increased domestic consumption or whether it's Europe or the Caribbean or where parts of Asia. But making that transition is something that takes time. You can't just flip a switch and say, well, we have been shipping to Pennsylvania for the last 40 years, and suddenly I'm going to ship to Pakistan. It doesn't work that way, especially in light of all the constraints that I've talked about with chaos and supply chains and all that sort of thing. But there's the sense that at least for some of our products, we can begin to explore other markets. In the slightly longer term, 12 to 18 months, 24 months, I think that notion that manufacturing is returning to North America could allow us to sort of think about
rebuilding the value-added food processing industries that we have lost a lot of over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, that we could be doing more canned and packaged foods in Canada that we have sort of moved away from, that represents perhaps a new opportunity for us. That's not going to solve the problem this season, probably not next year's season, but a couple of years from now. So this is part of the notion of, make sure you have a plan, because we don't know how long this is going to go, and how we respond today needs to be laying the groundwork for what we might have to do 2 years from now or 3 years from now if we need to. Bill, does that make sense from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the greenhouse industry is going to be hit pretty hard, and especially down the southwest in Essex, because there's a lot of Essex that's under greenhouse, and they're exporting fruits and vegetables to the U.S. And I would think they'll just pull the plug, and there won't be much of that produced there. And they're already kind of insulated and self-dependent because they're off the grid, but producing their own electricity and all kinds of good things, right? But certainly locally, beef industry is going to be pretty badly hit. The price of beef's already fallen 13% in 2 days, so everybody's getting $500 less for finished cattle at this point. There was a load of black calves went across the Saskatchewan border this morning, and they had to put up $36,000 to get it across to the U.S. customers. So it's pretty serious with 25%. It's not high math, right? But I think I keep looking at Jeanette here, and I mean, keep thinking about local food and how that may encourage some of the things that a lot of us have been wanting to do forever, right? And have more local-based food systems that truly work, because they don't work very well right now because there's not enough support to make them happen. So.
Something, Jeanette, you want to comment on?
Yeah, so we're a vegetable producer. We grow about 200 acres of vegetables, and we had a huge order for the spring. It's being shipped to the States, and we got an email back saying our governments aren't playing nice. We're not going to put the order in. It was like 9 transport trucks full of produce. We just, we have the plants in the ground. You're just not going to harvest them. You're going to leave them. You can't sell it. You don't want to put all the labor into it. The cost of inputs. So if you're bringing in fertilizer, any chemicals, seed, we put our seed orders in a long time ago. We've already got a whole bunch, but a lot of it comes from the States. Something we've done is, try and source out west and bring in some other products. But as a farmer, I feel like we just eat the cost. We can't charge anymore for our stuff because no one can afford to pay it. So we just keep decreasing, and try and be more efficient. But you get to a point where you can't be any more efficient, and you can't the beef price dropping like that. Like, that's insane, and you just eat it. Like, you just.
Well, we're dealing with businesses that want a 5 to 6% margin to start that.
I think we have a question or a comment online.
Yeah, Mulmer Township can go first.
Hi, it's Janet Horner here. And I guess I was, first of all, I want to say, I think in Canada, we've become complacent in that thinking, well, it's easy to ship to the US. They've been a trusted partner. Yeah, so we've kind of concentrated all our efforts shipping to the US and forgot about some of the other markets maybe that were a little more difficult. So I think we're going to have to get on those other markets quickly. My question really is about the food processing sector. And, a lot of we are a branch plant economy. And I just wonder how much true investment are we going to see in the next while as the US decides they're going to keep all their money stateside and not improve processing or technology in the branch plants that they seem to have in Canada. So that's one of my fears, is that we're going to play second string here for a long time, and there won't be a lot of new money coming in because our market is not as large and strong as that American market.
Yeah, it seems to me that one of the unintended or intended consequences of all of this is to kind of create a bit of a chill in terms of investment flowing to Canada. So yeah, we may see, particularly in light of this kind of reinvestment in North America, we may see an expansion of the food processing or food manufacturing related to foodstuffs sort of increasing. But how much of that is likely to come to Canada, given the current political climate? Well, probably not a lot. And what does come faces some pretty significant cost barriers compared to what might be available in the States. There may be tactics down the road for shifting some of that cost equation. If Saskatchewan decides to cut off potash to the US, that's going to put a lot of American farm production in the toilet and will create food shortages in parts of the US. And so that would drive prices back up, might make the US more amenable to kind of taking Canadian agricultural products. But that's a kind of a pretty nasty thing to do to your neighbor, right? So I think we don't really know where it's going to go, but there are both opportunities and dangers in all of this. There was a hand here. Oh, okay, sorry. We'll go online again first.
I think
You're muted.
Hello, Mr. Dickinson. Thank you very much for presenting here.
It's Brock for sure.
Oh, sorry, Brock. One economist to another. We're just a small little goat dairy outside of Arthur, Ontario, and I think it might be wise just to maybe just talk more about the effects of. We just had a share about the tomatoes there. What really triggered me here is that we're not creating any new demand here, and America imports at least I think it's at 60% of our beef that we produce here in Canada. That demand is not going to go anywhere. Maybe you could maybe expand on the fact that demand is still there, but Canadian and Mexican priced beef is being raised, and other places the price has not been raised. So really what's happening here is that we're being priced out of the market. Is there anything that you can maybe say on that?
So in a sense, your suggestion is this gives an advantage to places like Argentina or other places like that.
Right, like Brazil typically is an alternative. Like the US is always going to demand a massive amount of beef, for instance. We're just 25% more expensive than we were last week. That demand is now going to go to the world for that beef because they're not going to make it domestically, not overnight. So I think the adage of inflation is likely, more likely than, say, the demand disappears.
Yeah, I think this is one of the big unknowns and probably one of the weaknesses in Trump's tariff agenda is that the demand for the products being tariffed doesn't go away. He's imagining, based on some of his comments and some of his rhetoric, he's imagining that this is somehow going to spur higher levels of production in the United States. Maybe. How long will that take?
5 years.
Yeah,
right?
5 years, 10 years. And I think, in the agricultural sector and others, the related question is, well, who's going to do the work in that increased capacity? Because we've just deported everybody who's come in from Latin America, right? There's this sense that some of these agendas that he's got are kind of mutually contradictory. And even to the point, okay, so he's got the tariffs, and he's going to replace the IRS and income tax with tariffs. But as soon as he builds domestic capacity to do all this stuff, well, he doesn't get any tariff income anymore, right? So the whole kind of construct seems to be a bit of a house of cards. You were very nice to sort of suggest I was an economist. I'm not an economist, so I'll defer to your expertise in this. But I think you're right to suggest the demand doesn't go away. The fault in the thinking is that somehow some American source of a replacement product is going to spring forward immediately. And when it doesn't, yeah, then we're competing with the Argentines and the Brazilians and the Mexicans. Well, it's not the Mexicans.
Yeah. So just to add to that, yeah, like I think maybe just to some of the viewers in the room here, we're like, I like to call myself a farmer, and I'm pretty sure there's quite a few farmers here in this meeting. just so that we're all focused on the fact that we're not creating new demand. Finding new markets is also something that's going to be quite labor intensive. What we could be embracing ourselves for is the fact that we're actually witnessing another demand destruction policy, very similar to what we saw during COVID. In preparation for that, I think there's intent behind these tariffs, and it's not to raise prices, it's not to do anything other than reduce demand. So I don't know if there's anyone else in the audience or yourself that might want to comment on that.
Yeah, we've got a couple of hands here, so let's.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Leo Blightarp. I'm a grain and oilseed producer in Dufferin County. And I've heard the saying that, yeah, we're not going to change demand. We're just going to shift logistics and transportation, which is what happened in 2018 when Trump had its first trade war with China. And by the way, the U.S. has lost a lot of soybean business with China since that trade war that they have not recouped. A lot of that soybean production comes from the U.S. or from Brazil now. So they've increased their production there probably 25-30% since the last 4 or 5 years. So I guess I'm in agriculture. Some people say I'm a gambler. So I still own a fair bit of commodity. The nice thing about the commodities I grow, I can store them for a length of time on my farm, but there's still a cost associated with storing it because you're not getting paid. So you have the carrying cost of whatever that is. But I believe ultimately that there's not going to be a whole lot of demand destruction unless people really get poor and can't afford to eat anything. And I'm even somewhat optimistic because I think some of our allies maybe would come to Canada preferentially to buy some of the grain and oil seeds we have. And we have some good infrastructure here in Ontario with a lot of ports around the Great Lakes. So a lot of my stuff actually gets in a boat either in Hamilton or Goderich and goes to wherever it goes. So I think as soon as the Seenway goes up, I'm told by some people that there's going to be increased demand for Ontario corn and wheat because some people are not going to want to come to the U.S. store right at the moment. So I'm optimistic about that. But I also wanted to point out that our federal government, in my view, has not been an ally in the last 5 or 6 years, largely because of its ideological position on greenhouse gases. I'm not going to debate that, but we pay a carbon tax here in Ontario, and we also pay a fertilizer tax once the war in Ukraine got going, and that fertilizer tariff is still there, even though the Agriculture Committee in the Parliament has said it has served no purpose, but they haven't got rid of it. So that's cost me about $20,000 a year on my farm versus a U.S. Similar sized producer. And the carbon tax is now, by the government's own estimates, costing me $45,000 a year. And again, grains, we still have a free trade agreement with the U.S., and grains are supposed to trade freely across our border. So it's American grain coming into us. They're not saying, oh, by the way, our Canadian producers, they have to pay a carbon tax. Here, we're going to give you a levy so that our Canadian farmers aren't disadvantaged. No, that doesn't happen. And there's a lot of U.S. ethanol coming into Canada. So there's enough ethanol coming in right now that would, if we were to produce all that ethanol in this country, would take 2/3 of our current Ontario-sized corn crop. There's that much ethanol coming into this country. So I don't know if that's one of the ones that are going to be reciprocal and be tariffed by our Canadian government. They haven't asked my opinion, but and I really think we need to be careful, as you pointed out, on what we tariff. I mean, I don't want to pay another. I bought all my fertilizer, by the way, because I was concerned about this happening. So I bought it all in the new year. And I understand that fertilizer has gone up 20 or 25% since then. But yeah, nobody wins with a tariff war. I think we could have some targeted tariffs, but somebody is always going to be a loser somewhere in the economy with tariffs. I could say a lot more, but I want to give opportunity to others. So I don't really have a question other than if you can have an impact on our federal government, that would be good.
There was another hand here in the front row to talk about some of these issues as well.
Sorry. I was just going to ask a question because what I haven't heard too much of, but I heard a little item on the radio. China has imposed tariffs on American, particularly agricultural products. China's still going to have to eat. Presumably, if it's going to cost us more to ship to the United States, 25% more, presumably markets are going to, I mean, I'm asking this as a question. I'm not stating it, but I would assume we're going to get increased markets in China. They eat a lot of beef and a lot of food, a lot of grains, a lot of pork, right?
Well, there's another trade action that happened about 6 or 7 months ago when we went to electrical vehicles. And we decided we're going to join the US and Europe in having a tariff. So China didn't respond to the US or Europe on that, as far as I know, but they did say we're going to launch a trade investigation into Canadian canola. Now, I don't think that's had any results yet that are impacting canola sales, but there's all these other things at play. And the US has also announced that they're not going to allow any US ships into any ports in the States. Any US ships or any operator that has a US ship in its fleet. So that almost excludes 90% of ocean freight from coming into the, well, they'll be allowed in, but they have to pay extra fees. And I don't know what those fees are, but there's all these different things going on, and yeah.
It's an unrelated notion, but you had mentioned earlier your own shipping through the St. Lawrence Seaway. That, to me, that's one of the trump cards that Canada hasn't talked about yet, is just like China imposed some tariffs on shipping, we certainly have that opportunity as well, that ports like Monroe, Duluth, and Cleveland could suffer if they can't get access to the Seaway. And so that may be one of those things that we have as a bit of a bargaining chip down the road as well. But again, who'd have thought we could be talking about those kinds of things 3 months ago? But I think we got another question online or a comment online.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat, Brock. It was just announced this afternoon that he is delaying tariffs again for the automakers, a sector that has been very local since the tariff war talks began. It needs a lot more noise from the agri-food and agriculture to get the same action, maybe. So that's a question. So maybe.
So I'm speculating because I've only heard limited things this afternoon. We've been here this afternoon, right? My understanding is that the big 3 automakers in Detroit went to the White House to try to get a carve out for the automotive sector this afternoon. Just for saying that this would be, it was what's the phrase they've all been using? You can't unscramble an omelet. So it would just be impossible to think about how to extricate the various aspects of the automotive industry from each other. So what happened, 3 big American companies went to the White House and sort of said, you can't do this. That's what we kind of lack in the ag space, I think, is that we don't have, 2, 3, 4 loud American voices arguing on behalf of an industry that sits in Canada. Maybe down the road we can. Maybe we can sort of marshal those supporters and those players. But I think that in this case, it was the Americans helping us rather than us helping ourselves to some extent. So now I also heard that the carve out for the auto sector was going to be for 30 days. So we'll see.
Sorry, there's one more question online. I believe Mulmer Township has their hand up.
No, sorry, we don't have any further questions.
Have you got any further answers for us that would be helpful too?
No, we don't have those either.
That's your job.
Oh, hi, good afternoon. My name is Sherry Ann Bedminster, and I'm in sustainability. So I have a question because we do have trade agreements with the EU. And one of the options is for us to, in order to diversify, we look at that market. But the EU also has a directive around what's happening with their climate and how things should be disclosed, and we've not been doing it here. So if our businesses are now looking at that market, I just wondered how we prepare them, or if you've got a thought, because they've also said, if you're coming into a market, you have to do it.
Yeah, and this is where Canada sort of gets caught in 2 different worlds. We see sort of diverging trends where the ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting requirements in the European Union are becoming stricter, and the US has determined that these are part of the woke agenda and they're going to get rid of them all, right? So we're kind of stuck. I think there is a political shift underway that will kind of change the government's approach to some of these things. I have heard more pro-pipeline talk in Canada in recent months than I've heard in years, for example. So there is a shift that gets created by these sorts of events. I think that when it comes to something like yes, I've been doing a fair bit of work with American communities over the last couple of years, and one of the things that we've learned is not to use the phrase ESG, environmental, social, and governance. That we can talk about things like sustainability, community, and good management. So sometimes it's just kind of shifting the labels a little bit, and I think that we're going to have to learn to be multilingual in that way if we want to expand our trade markets. Because typically we have tended to follow the process of what's happening in the U.S. because that was where we're going to send our stuff. If we want to do business with Europe, if we want to do business with the UK potentially, if we want to do business with parts of Asia, then we have to kind of continue to sort of understand the regulations and structures that they have in place that we're going to have to kind of act and operate within. Do some work with an industrial park in New Brunswick that is putting in place its first sustainability policy, not because the folks running the park are particularly green in their orientation, but because they want to land European companies and they know those companies have to report legally on their environmental performance. And so understanding the footprint of their operations in an industrial park is part of that. So I think that from one perspective, that bodes well that we may sort of get more adept at thinking about those issues and how we kind of integrate them into our work. On the other hand, there's a degree to which that might be some greenwashing as well. We might be sort of playing a bit of lip service to things just so we can make sure we've got access to that European market. And I think where we end up on that, I don't know. It depends on what sort of emerges out of the dust of this kerfuffle 2-3 years from now. But I do feel like change is in the air in terms of where we place the emphasis on sustainability, climate, and those sorts of things. I will say just back to the ag sector and the climate thing, regardless of what we think about global warming and the causes of global warming, we can see the impacts of rising temperatures on food production in some places like China. And so fast forward 10-15 years, China will probably not be able to produce enough food to feed itself. And so back to that demand factor in the agricultural space, if enough places follow that sort of a model, there could be increased global demand for food. There's certainly going to be increased global demand for water and potash and inputs in the agricultural space. That could do some work towards raising the prices and helping us to sort of access new markets. So I'm always sort of quick to say that, regardless of where you fall on the climate issue, keep in mind the kind of the ecological implications of what's happening and how that will shift markets moving forward.
Well, a question and a couple other points. So we are a country rich in natural resources, but a lot of them we're not developing because we have such rigorous environmental standards to build any plant anywhere, and nobody wants it in their backyard. So that's why we're going to Russia to get these fertilizer. Like we have lots of natural gas, but we can't bring it to Eastern Canada. Well, we do bring some, but it's made, there's a plant in Courtright, Ontario that makes DEF, diesel exhaust fluid. It used to make nitrogen products that it ships to the US. So I don't know if they're going to be cut off. So maybe we can get some nitrogen out of there for our purposes. But there's no reason why we couldn't bring more natural gas here and manufacture our own nitrogen products. And I understand there's a fairly big resource of phosphorus in Quebec that could be developed. But again, it's cheaper because of environmental regulations and standards to get those products offshore, which when the war with Russia happened became a problem. So those kind of things that the government could be a little bit more favorable to us here in Canada, and we wouldn't be shipping these things halfway across the world. The other thing I was kind of wondering a little bit about, like we signed this CUSMA. I was asked to go to one of the meetings with all the folks in Ottawa and give my opinion on what I thought about it. And I said, well, I'm all for free trade as long as it's free trade. But there's really no such thing as free trade because you get all these other non-tariff barriers and everything else going on. But my understanding is we signed a deal, Mr. Trump signed a deal that was going to be in effect till 2026, and then it would be reviewed. And I don't think he pays a whole lot of attention to any court rulings or any law at all, but is there any ground to challenge the fact that he's breaking his own rule at least a year ahead of schedule, and it was supposed to be a collective review of where we are with the different things that went into making CUSMA a few years ago?
Yeah, to me, that's a great question. And I keep coming back to this notion we have to have a plan. I haven't heard anybody talking about that in the plan, but technically everything that Donald Trump has done for the last 6 weeks is illegal, right? It's a violation of the free trade agreement. And any change to the free trade agreement requires 6 months notification to the other parties of the agreement, right? So even if he wanted to do this stuff, and even if he found a loophole in the agreement to do it, theoretically, he's supposed to give 6 months warning before any of this happens. And so I think that the whole tariff agenda is vulnerable to legal challenges. I don't know if anybody's making those legal challenges, right? Like I haven't heard that from the federal government in terms of the various things that they're trying to do. But I do think that, yeah, he might choose to ignore the courts, but there becomes a point at which it's difficult to do that. That might be 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road. But if we don't start now, it'll be 10 or 15 years down the road, right? So I would love to see that emerge as part of our national response to this. I don't know if anybody else has any insights into that aspect of the question. Do we have a lawyer?
I heard it come up a little bit, but to be honest, not a lot. And so it made me think, if you're going to just change on a whim based on the administration, why are we signing long-term agreements? Right? Maybe it should be a 4-year agreement to be reviewed at that time. But no, my thought though is that even if we go to the courts, like you said, it could be 3, 4 years, he's not going to listen, right? And so maybe that's a little discouraging, but I agree that you should get it documented in some way.
It was interesting. Premier Ford yesterday talked about how he was looking forward to the midterms to rein President Trump in. Right? Well, that's November of 2026. It's a little ways down the road. So we might be backed into a spot where there's no quick timelines on some of these things. That the legal cases might take a while to unfold, and if he continues to ignore them, how do you hold him accountable? Well, maybe the electorate does at some point, but that's a time-consuming process too. I will say on the agreement side of things, there's not necessarily logic in chaos monkey world, but so many of the things that he's talked about. Okay, so let's imagine an invasion of Greenland. That invokes Article 5 of the NATO Accord. So immediately the United States is not declaring war on Greenland, but on France and the United Kingdom and Germany and Canada. Because under the terms of Article 5, we would have to go and defend Greenland, right? So legal agreements, treaties, protocols that are long established do not seem to count for much in the eyes of the current administration. And I don't think we're likely to end up with a massive ground war in Greenland, but these things suddenly, they take on bigger implications than I think the White House has considered in many instances. And so, again, separating bluff from actual planning is difficult to do, but legal agreements don't seem to carry much weight. Certainly didn't in the Ukrainian context, right? The notion of security guarantees were one of the things that were front and center. Well, how do you trust the US government now to offer a security guarantee? You can't. How do we trust them to sign a new version of the USMCA? We can't.
I think it goes back to originally what you were saying, Brock. The United States
Was originally positioned to be the police force, right? To help the world globally kind of stay within these boundaries and these norms and work within rules. But if they're the ones that are breaking the rules themselves, well then where does that leave them in the court, like in the court of public opinion? And I don't know if they actually, and by they I mean Trump, really care.
On that cheery note, I see more hands going up. Yeah. Yeah, so you've had your hand up several times. No. We keep missing you, sorry.
Just a couple of comments. If I'm wrong, I know I'll be corrected, but the vast majority of farms in Dufferin County are family farms. The only reason our son farms is because his mother and I helped him. Our farmland, like yours is worth millions and millions and millions. We've allowed him to farm. We don't have a lot of push with corporations and everything else. Like this lady said, spring's coming. Like farmers are the masters of survival. Family farms have been doing it for 200 years. We've gone through war, drought, COVID, Trump, we always survive. But we can only survive for so long. The last comment I got back a week ago from the biggest draft horse sale in America, Champaign, Illinois, which is in the Bible Belt and the Green Belt of America. We've been going there for 30 years. We weren't welcome there. Canadians have always been the best buyers and the best sellers. Anybody that took a Canadian horse this year brought it back home. We were not welcome. And the double whammy to that is people bringing horses back got clobbered at the Canadians. Well, this is an American horse. Like, you can't fix stupid like that. We're getting it from all sides. So here, an independent farmer, a family farm, the cattle business, believe me, we don't have the time to wait for 3 or 4 years. We're in a bad state right now. So it's we'll survive probably, but
Why weren't you welcome down in Illinois?
Well, number one, you're in Trump belt. You're in Republican territory, and we've been going there for 30 years. We have some of our best friends are down there, but they misinformation. They think we're bringing horses down there. We're taking jobs away from young people. We're taking all this other stuff. We were not welcome. So then you turn around and you start to think you can't converse with an American that gets his backbone of knowledge from Fox News. You can't discuss it with them. So all of a sudden we're down there, and I turned to Ian Greenwood. He's been going down there since he's a young lad, and I said, "Boy, this is different. That everything about this is different." One of the elders from the Amish church said to me, he said, "You haven't quite figured this out yet." And I said, "What?" And he said, "They want you to bring your money down and buy horses, but don't bring your horses back. We don't want you here anymore." Nothing wrong with talking with an honest man, but it was an awful shock. And believe me, from what we're hearing, no matter what we went through this horse sale, the cattlemen are just, it's going to get ugly and nasty, and we don't have a lot of time. So it's anyway, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
There were a couple of other hands that went up as well.
That just kind of changed my train of thought. Back to the tariffs and agriculture, like everyone eats. If you don't eat, you eventually die. And it's, you need raw materials to make processed food. And so I think we're, the auto industry, makes a lot of jobs and a lot of money, but ultimately we all need food, and without those raw materials you can't have any manufacturing at all. So I think that there needs to be some kind of support for our industry, because in the States they get tons of government support for farming, and they have they had cheap labor until it all left, and it's going to hurt everybody. It's going to, when it comes down to food and raw materials. So yeah.
There was a hand on this side as well.
Well, I just wanted to make the point. I'm also a director on the Grain Farmers of Ontario, so we get together with about 15 of us every now and then. And there's a couple of us in the U.S. right now because they have this commodity classic where the big three crop commodity organizations meet, and this year it's in Denver. But anyway, the soybean producers and the corn producers are somewhat sympathetic because they have a lot of stuff coming up this way too. So that, they don't want to pay, but so they put out a couple communiques, and the corn producer asked Trump to negotiate a solution so that they wouldn't be disadvantaged. And the soybean guy said, well, they really were hurt hard in 2018 because of the trade action with China, and they've never recouped that market. We need to be able to be seen as a reliable supplier, or our buyers are going to go somewhere else. But I think something that was lost in both of those communiques, that if we're going to have agreements, they have to be beneficial to both parties. And there has to be a lot of trust. And if we don't have that, what's the point in having an agreement? And so if we don't have a rules or law-based agreement, we're not going to go very far together. And the part of the reason for free trade is everybody in the world is going to benefit. And I truly believe in that. And I don't mind competing with anybody in the US as long as or anybody in the world, as long as, there aren't other extenuating circumstances. The US is great for subsidizing their agriculture. They continue to attack our supply management. I'm not in favor or against supply management. Sometimes I wish I wasn't supply management, but they keep going after dairy here in this country. But they're one of the biggest subsidizers of American dairy going. Whenever they squeal, they get lots of money. So there's lots of other things. Agriculture gets caught up in so many different things that are beyond our control. But at the end of the day, trade has to be predicated on fairness or perceived fairness or some level of, and I don't mind being a little bit disadvantaged, but when it gets to 15 or 20%, because these are commodities that are produced anywhere, they're basically the same, whether they're produced here or in Australia or in China or in Russia or South America. And most animals that eat our corn, or most of the corn that goes into ethanol or has gone into processing, I can't distinguish where it comes from. Maybe the Kentucky bourbon whiskey that nobody's going to be able to buy anymore. We'll know some difference there, but.
Thanks, Jasmine. One of the things that's okay, Jasmine, thanks. One of the things that I think, our old world order was predicated on was that things were fair and that we could have win-win situations and we could have agreements where all parties were advantaged, where it appears that we've moved into a zero-sum world where there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. And the American administration has determined that they will be the winners and that everyone else will be the losers. So in a world full of other losers, how do we come to grips with that? And what measures can we take to be winners with the rest of the world? We've talked about that a little bit, but what do we do as Canadians to get past that idea that things are fair and you can move and have win-win situations when it doesn't really appear like that's the case any longer?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The notion of a zero-sum game in a world where everybody is a loser is definitely the world that the Trump administration is sort of aiming for. They may think they're going to be the winner and everybody else is the loser. But I think there are other places that do not believe that, right? Like, I think that's been one of the kind of the stark differences between European and American attitudes over the last month or so, right? And so it's this notion of kind of, well, you need to work with the people that have the same mindset as you. Like, who else believes that we can have win-win relationships? And let's strengthen those relationships. We're at some geographic disadvantages for that, right? Because aside from Hans Island up there in the Arctic, right, we only border the United States. We don't have easy access to anybody else. So that places some constraints on us, but it doesn't mean that there's a shortage of people out there who might not be prepared to work with us and be interested in working with us. The UK is desperately searching for new trade partners because they got rid of the ones they had, right? The Europeans are sort of feeling very unstable and looking for close allies. And so, I think there's things that we can do. One of the fastest growing parts of the world economy in the next few years will be South Asia. So places like, or Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia. We should be, looking to build new relationships in that part of the world. And maybe there's win-win opportunities there. I think the other thing is that I gotta feel like the winner-take-all attitude sort of burns itself out at some point. And there's a couple of reasons for that. This is, again, back to our Nobel economist who talked about the chaos monkeys. He also sort of made the point that Trump appears to want to kind of win at the sort of balance of trade stuff, right? Well, how is he subsidizing Canada? Because we sold more goods to the US than they sold to us. So he sees that as a subsidy. So he wants to eliminate that. But this takes him into the field of balance of trade, which is called a balance because your inflows and your outflows have to equal each other. So if he wins in terms of the trade side of things, he's going to lose in terms of cash flows. And there's a logic to some aspects of economics that probably eludes this administration a little bit. You can't win at everything. You can choose things to win at, but you can't be the winner at everything. And as that realization sinks in, it may prompt a bit of a rethink of some of these policies. I'm wading into the territory of the economist there, who's now got his hand up, so I may have said precisely the wrong thing. But yeah, go ahead. You've got some more thoughts?
No, sorry, it's another thought, but thanks for sharing that. Just going back, take a few steps back here. We were just talking about I think it was a great discussion, just reiterating that the demand is not going anywhere, which is for all the farmers here in the room, we just have to take a deep breath and just remember that. The one thing that we actually haven't been able to touch on, and maybe if you could expand on it, is we haven't really talked about currency. And from way back when I was at school, currency was also a method of, let's say, taxation or tariffs. In this case right now, we noticed in the last probably 30 days that our exchange rate has been in favor for the US dollar. And my question to you would be, where do you see it in 18 months if we continue down this up and down yo-yo act of tariff wars? Where do you think the currency, the Canadian currency, even on a world stage as well? Because that in itself will dictate where our products will go if we grow them. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, again, I was me pretending to be an economist, so I appreciate your input on this. But so when I looked this morning, there's a sense that maybe we were going to get a carve out for some things like the automotive industry. So the Toronto Stock Exchange was up, the value of the dollar was up, and I think we're in for that yo-yo. We get good news, things are going to go up. When we get bad news, they're going to fall. Generally, all of this uncertainty, I think, makes the Canadian dollar vulnerable. It is more likely to decline than to rise while there's levels of uncertainty. So that's tough for our purchasing power. That's tough for consumers trying to shop. It's tough for inflation. It's not bad for export, right? So if our currency drops 5 or 10%, that offsets a lot of the impact of the tariffs themselves, right? The fact that our currency falls makes our goods cheaper in that US market. And part of why our currency is falling is because the American dollar is rising. It's not directly correlated, but there's an element to which they're pretty closely linked. So their products, as their dollar rises, get more expensive, not just in Canada, but everywhere, where ours, because they're falling, start to get cheaper. And so it does give us a bit of a mitigating factor against the tariffs. I don't want to rely on a weak dollar to kind of save the economy, but it's one of those things that if we're trying to figure out how we're going to make it through the next 12 or 18 months, at least that's potentially playing in our favor. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great general summary there. My next thought would be like you had a great picture graph there about our energy exports to the US. And just as a reminder, I think it was around that 60% of US imported oil is coming from Canada. That is just a fabulous way of showing that our trump card, pun intended, our trump card is the oil that we ship to the US. And I'm not too certain, but that price is actually fixed at the moment. I don't believe it's at the open market rate, just for most of the people that are in the room here. So really, is it a power play here? I think the only play that we have is to stop shipping oil. And I think by our Alberta Premier there is not looking to do anything of that matter. Is there, with the lower potential currency, can we see the world stage demanding more of our oil products, or beef, or pork, agriculture? Do you see that, like even by 10%, do you see our exports to other countries being more favorable?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this becomes a time question as well, though, right? So oil, part of the reason we're trapped at those lower prices with the US market is that we don't have the ability to get our oil to ports or to alternative destinations. I think this builds political pressure for pipelines, for example, which have been off the table for the last decade or two, but suddenly are kind of back into the mix of things to consider. Europe would love to have access to our oil and our natural gas since they've been cut off from the Russians. And so there's this sense that there is a market there. It is something we could do. It would definitely kind of, from an economic perspective, would be a good card to play in the context of tariffs and the Trump war, or tariffs and the trade war. I'm going to call it the Trump war from now on. But you know, what's the timeline to build a pipeline that could allow us to get oil or gas to Europe, right? 5 years, 7 years, 10 years? We've got duty to consult with indigenous communities. We've got environmental assessments to be done. We've got sort of all sorts of labor assessments. We've got to find the money to do it. And so there is a timeline challenge around some of those things. But I think the general principle of get more of our stuff to the places that can be better markets for it than the ones we have now. It's not just that we're reliant on the US market, it's that we've been selling stuff to the Americans for less than we could sell it somewhere else in some of these instances, right? And I'll say that I don't think oil is the only place that we could do that. I guess we'll see where Alberta goes over the course of this, but I do think potash is a place that we could play that hand. I think electricity is a place, and as I mentioned earlier, I think that we could levy some pretty heavy tariffs on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And I think we need to sort of think strategically about what are the cards that we've got that the US has no alternative to. They don't get their potash from us or their uranium from us. Where are they going to get it? If they don't get their electricity from Quebec and Ontario and Newfoundland, where are they going to get it? And you hate to be mean, say I'm going to threaten the other side, but I think in my more aggressive moments, I think Doug Ford said it right when he said, "I'm going to shut off the electricity with a smile on my face."
I think Yao was next.
Okay.
So we're talking big picture here, which is really, really important. I moved to a smaller lens because, I got to feed the people that are in our area. I worry about tariffs and their food costs and things like that. For me, it's probably going to cost me an extra $100,000 this year. But if I have to spend the money, how can I spend it locally? And that's what I don't know. What don't I know about what's in this room, what's outside this room within Dufferin County? So I already texted you halfway through the meeting to say, how do I buy a truckload of your vegetables? And how do I take your contact information and move it to the provincial association or reach out to the Berry Food Bank or the Guelph Food Bank or whoever else is buying vegetables? We can't do it all, but I can do some. And so what don't I know and how can I access what you have? Because I don't know what you have. And if I knew, right, because you've got all the Canadian lists, but I got to sort through it to find the Dufferin things. So that's what I need to do my small part. I can't do a large part, but I can do a small part, and I can flip people the bird when we think about this. So anyways, but I'll do my part. It'll be hard, but locally, I'd love to know what I can do.
Yeah.
So I can kind of answer that question a little bit. There are ongoing efforts at the county level to come up with a list. So we already even have stickers here that we are going to be encouraging people at the end of this to take and sort of distribute and place them around their businesses. But we are working with local municipal partners as well as, and we know the Dufferin Board of Trade has a good directory. So sorting through all those resources that are out there and coming up with a list of places where people can shop local. But I had a question, Brock, and this is sort of self-serving. Coming into this year, one of our major projects that we wanted to work on was an investment attraction strategy. And this was before all this tariff talk. And I'm glad you kind of touched on, some of the efforts that are going on in other communities around mapping your supply chain and sort of figuring out the vulnerabilities within your community. How do we position that investment attraction strategy in a way that makes us stronger around all this trade war and everything around it?
Nothing like 5 minutes left to answer the big giant question. And this is something I'm wrestling through. Yeah, wrestling through with the province right now as well. This new role as vice chair of Invest Ontario is, what are the industries we track? We've had huge success in the last year around electric vehicles. What does that mean in the context of tariffs? I don't know. I think you're going to see some more stuff coming down the pipeline in pharmaceuticals and in critical minerals and things like that hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet. But I would say there's a few things. So where is the investment likely to come from? I don't think that investment is likely to flow to us from the US in the near future. That's been our sort of traditional sort of source of most of our investment attraction. So if it's not coming from the US, then I would start to look at some of those demographic factors that I talked about before. Where are there countries that have high levels of existing investment that can no longer find a workforce to undertake that work? So that leads me to places like China, like Germany, like Italy, like the Netherlands. There's a sort of a suite of countries that have been sort of the backbone of the industrial economy for the 20th century that are probably moving out of that space because they don't have the workers to do that work. And because their own markets are shrinking, and so that kind of domestic support for those industries isn't really there. I'd say though the trickier part is if we're having to, our traditional play was, well, come to Canada because then you can access the North American market. And for at least the next few months, we can't say that. So what we're really saying is come to Canada because you can't work as well at home and because you want to access the Canadian market. And I think one of the things that we often overlook, because we live next to the United States, which is 350 million people, it's the biggest market in the world, is that we're a big country too. 40, 41 million people is not insignificant. And when you kind of stack us up against many other spots on the globe, you put us in Europe, we'd be like the third or fourth largest country in Europe, not geographically, but population-wise. A 40 million person market is going to be really interesting to some companies. And so that notion of, get the checklist. What are the companies that are likely to leave the places that are in? What are the industries that are likely to be able to do well in Canada? What are the industries where we can serve a market of 40 million people? Start to put that list together, and that'll give you some insights into who you should be targeting. Does that make sense? Sure.
How can you stop products like potatoes and cranberries going to the States to be processed? How can you stop that? You're paying a lot more.
Yeah, there's no question that who buying them at the American end is going to pay more for them. The tariffs are going to bite as deeply there as they do here. I think this kind of leads to so it punishes American consumers, and I guess our hope is that American consumers feel it enough that they complain to their government, and the government sort of changes the rules, and we end up not in a trade war. What's the alternative? I'm looking forward to the days of cranberry smuggling, right? Why did we do this? We're worried about fentanyl and illegal aliens flowing from Canada? I don't think so. You put a 25% tax on everything, you're going to open up one of the biggest smuggling markets we've ever seen in North America, right? It's like, if I can just sneak this across the border, suddenly it's 25% cheaper. Like, we're about to see all kinds of gray market stuff start to take place. So we get our cranberries and our potatoes down to the people who want them. But anyway.
Back up Canada. Processed in the States, grown in Canada, processed in the States, and shipped back up.
Yes, we definitely need to find ways to do more value adding closer to home. Absolutely. I'm conscious of the time. You are all busy people who have taken 2 hours out of your schedule. I've enjoyed the chance to kind of share some ideas. I hope some of the things I've talked about have been useful. Happy to stick around for a while to answer some questions, but I'll turn things back to Yao.
Thank you very much, Brock. Let's give it up for Brock. That was great. That was awesome. Okay, so before everyone gets out of here, just looking at time as well, I just really wanted to lay out the roadmap that we have ahead of us. This is the first of 5 seminar series, 5 seminars that we're going to be having. So the second one, we actually have our speaker secured already for that one. Ryan Gibson from the University of Guelph. Some of you may be familiar with him. Very well experienced in the rural and agricultural context. And so when he comes in, we're hoping to dive in on the Dufferin context a little bit more. In the third seminar, we are hoping to dive in on some data. Right now, we're in the process of gathering a lot of primary data, and we'll be reaching out to a number of you folks here in the room and online to really get information from you. And then we'll be diving a little bit deeper into the data. The fourth and fifth one is when we start to plan for the future. I sort of mentioned our investment attraction strategy. One of the things we want to do is roll in some of that data into that strategy. So lots of information to come. If you guys don't mind, because we have your email addresses, because you're registrants, we'll be sharing information on the subsequent seminars. But thank you all once again for attending this one. And also, we have a lot of stickers here. I should have brought some copies with me. So we've got some decals, we've got flyers, we've got stickers here in the room, basically telling people to shop in Dufferin. And so we encourage you to take as many as you can and display them within your businesses, your windows, your doors, so that we can build up that message and out there. We're also going to be sharing a lot of information online as well and collaborating with our local municipalities and partners around the shop in Dufferin effort. So lots more information to come, but I strongly encourage everyone in the room to grab some copies of those stickers. So thank you all. Thank you.